Hello, I'm going to review the Argonaut, which is this tank, the Tier 9 Season Tank. You get this after you unlock the Quetzal and fully upgrade it, and you get it as stock with 3 modules. Wargaming has added an extra set of modules on this tank, so they are the V5 modules. Usually tanks max modules are V4, but because this doesn't have a turret, Wargaming has added this extra set for you to grind. So this is a Tier 9 Hybrid Nation tank destroyer. As you can see, it is a casemate tank destroyer. So I'll get right into its stats. Here you can see its armor. This is against a Leopard prototype. So this is 240mm of AP. You can see its upper plate is an auto ricochet angle, and that's quite nice to have because it can bounce some shots, especially if enemies aren't aiming. Yesterday I faced a Sheridan who bounced off it twice, even using heat, so if enemies don't aim well then they definitely will bounce off that part. But you can see that the sort of area around the front, the rounded bit, and the lower plate is a easy penetration for most tanks to go through. It's not HE penetrable because it's over 100mm thick, but it is weak to HESH if enemies have that type of ammo. Now switching to the heat view, this is 290mm of heat penetration, and you can see what happens to the upper plate, because heat can just ignore the 70-degree auto ricochet angle. It does penetrate more of the upper plate, and you can see that with the sort of upper sides that are closer to the back of the tank. But this area right under the gun is still red, and that is because the Leopard PTA has 290mm of heat penetration, and the upper plate of the Argonaut is actually around 300, or up to 340-ish, and you can see that here. So this is the Argonaut against its own level of penetration, 256 on standard ammo. You can see that auto ricochet angle on the upper plate. Shells just ricochet off. Of course it's possible to ricochet and then penetrate, as shown here. But then if you switch to heat, you can see this is 370mm of heat, so it's not a good representation. Most tanks will have less heat penetration than this, but you can see against heat penetration, the upper plate 330 there, 315 there, 280 there, 260 up there, and 260 over there. So it's still a pretty decent thickness, especially if you consider Tier 8 heavy tanks even have generally 270mm of heat on their ammo. In fact, there are no Tier 8 heavy tanks that have more heat penetration on their premium ammo. You'd have to use calibrated shells for that. Now switching to HE, this tank has 72mm of penetration on HE, and you can see the gun shield isn't that weak. That is a risky shot to be taking, especially with the gun in the way. If the enemy tank is moving it around or moving the hull, that is a risky shot you might not want to take, because there is a chance that you miss due to your dispersion, and of course because the tank is moving you might shoot here, but then oh look, it's no longer a penetration. So it's a risky shot for the gun shield, so generally it doesn't get high explosive penetrated. On the side though, it's a different story, because the sides are flat and weak, and also the hull sides, though they are angled, rounded, you can penetrate them because they're only 62. And of course the rear is very weak, and this part counts as 0mm up here. So the armor is decent, considering it can't be HE penetrated from the front by most tanks. That's pretty decent, considering a lot of tank destroyers are just very easy to penetrate with HE, or just easy to cut through with AP. This one, it makes you aim. Yes, you won't bounce many shots, but at least it does have that upper plate. Moving to its gun, its damage is 430 on AP, which is very nice considering it has a 7.4 second reload. It gives it 3500 DPM basically. Now for Tier 9, you have to consider Tier 9 has a bunch of very high DPM tank destroyers, so this DPM might not look that impressive, but it is quite good DPM, and it is definitely nice to have, especially when you consider a 7.4 second reload is almost as fast as a lot of medium tanks reloads at this tier. You won't be able to out DPM a lot of other tank destroyers. For example, the Jagdtiger has 3,900 DPM, the Su-122-54 has basically 4,000 DPM, the Tortoise has upwards of 3,800. So those tanks do just absolutely trash this tank's DPM, but by no means is the Argonaut's DPM low or bad. It's definitely good DPM, especially facing non-tank destroyer tanks. Looking at its damage on heat, that's just average, 370. 510 on HE is low. Consider that tanks with 400 alpha damage do 500 or 515. This one has an extra 30 alpha damage but only does 510 on its HE. So the HE isn't worth using against tanks that might use Spore Liner because it will just do much less damage than your AP. In terms of penetration, AP is quite low for a tank destroyer. 356 isn't great for a tank destroyer in tier 9. A lot of tank destroyers have 370, 380, even 3... No, tank destroyers don't have 390. But yeah, this is a typo. It's 256mm of penetration, not 356. That is a crazy amount of penetration to have. 256 is more like a heavy tank. The Conqueror, for example, has 259. So 256 is just mediocre penetration. Other tank destroyers, like the Jagdtiger, has 276. The Chinese tier 9 tank destroyer, WZ-111 GFT, that has 290mm. So this is just quite mediocre penetration. Note that it's 256, not 356. Heat, 370. That is the highest in tier 9 after the Chinese tank destroyer, which has 375. This is amazing penetration. You do not need calibrated shells. That's completely overkill. You're crazy if you use that. 370 can easily cut through basically anything you face. Of course, not some hull down tanks, heavy tanks, but it's enough to go through almost anything that you'll come up against. And that heat penetration really is amazing. You won't struggle to penetrate much. High explosive of 72, that's nice. This is a 120mm gun. Most 120mm guns have 60. This has 72, so it's quite a lot more. Aim time, 3.5, 3.3. That's not bad. But its base aim time is actually quite mediocre. That is not great for a tier 9 tank destroyer, and you'll see it in a minute when I compare it to some other tank destroyers. This aim time is actually quite mediocre. But the reason this isn't bad is that it's made up for by some of the best gun handling of any tank destroyer in the game. 0.12, 0.12, 0.12 is amazing. Generally, this level is more reserved for medium or light tanks, and tank destroyers generally have worse gun handling because they don't have turrets, and they have to trade it for having a higher damage output. But this tank has amazing gun handling. It means you can really be quite active and move around a lot and be turning the hull, and still retain just a very good level of accuracy just because of this on-movement gun handling. And you need that because its accuracy isn't that great either. 0.335 is very mediocre for tier 9, so I would definitely recommend using Refined Gun, which I do, and especially due to having such good gun stabilization, definitely use Refined Gun. Gun depression is 6, that is awkward. You can see on this tank the gun is mounted quite high. This isn't a small tank. Let's compare it to this Lorraine, for example. Look how small the Lorraine is compared to this tank. Or the Waffenträger. See how high the gun is mounted on the tank. And it's also very far back, which is a problem because if it was more forward, you'd be able to aim down a bit more and use it in sort of closer situations. But since it's mounted on the back, your hull is sort of propping up the gun as you go forward, which makes it quite awkward in many situations. On top of this, the tank is just tall, so that again doesn't help. But 6 degrees is okay, it's not unusable. It's a tank destroyer anyway, so it's not like you're always going to be trying to use gun depression positions. 13 degrees of gun traverse to either side, left or right, is actually pretty nice. Most tank destroyers have 10, or sometimes even less. So the gun overall is great. The gun is definitely the best bit of this tank. Mobility, mobility is quite nice. It's 42 kilometers per hour forwards, which is pretty good for a tank destroyer. 12 in reverse is very slow. That is very awkward to have on a tank destroyer, especially because this one doesn't have a turret and its armor isn't great, so it's sort of not justified why it reverses so slowly. But of course, having more would make it very flexible, and it's just a balancing factor. Traverse speed 49.3, that is actually very nice for any tank destroyer really. 49 is more like a medium tank's traverse because it's just able to turn on a dime basically, and with such a potent sort of gun with 430 alpha and good DPM, the good traverse speed does allow you to play quite actively at later points in the battle. So the medium terrain traverse is much worse, and that is because it has 1.3 terrain resistances, the same as the other season tanks in this season. This is still not bad traverse. It's almost 40 degrees, which is pretty decent for a tank destroyer, and it doesn't feel too bad when you're playing it in-game. It is worth noting though, if an enemy tank is circling you, especially a faster one like a light tank or a fast medium, this is sometimes not good enough. So it's better to try and stay on hard terrain, especially if you're afraid enemy tanks might rush you or circle around you, because you just gain 11 degrees of traverse speed on hard terrain. So acceleration rate is good, almost 18. This tank weighs 66 tons, so actually you can ram enemy tanks, and that's why it has 1,173 horsepower, which is a lot for a tank destroyer. So its actual acceleration is 18 on hard terrain and almost 14 on medium terrain. Both of these are pretty good, not bad at all, but due to these terrain resistances you do notice the tank is quite a bit less mobile on medium terrain. It's still not bad though. Now going to equipment. The equipment I've gone with is gun rammer, and the reason for this is you do not need calibrated shells at all. As a sniping tank destroyer, which this tank is in a lot of situations, there's nothing you can do to make your DPM better other than use adrenaline. So gun rammer is really the only thing which can make you reload faster and just make you be able to clutch some of those situations where you need that fast reload. And as a tank destroyer, unlike heavy tanks or medium tanks, it's not like you can choose the engagement. If enemy tanks rush you, there's nothing you can do. You can't choose to run away, you can't choose to basically use terrain to your advantage because you don't have a turret. All you can do really is rely on your DPM and your gun to try and get you out of that situation, because tank destroyers trade out a lot of stats to have just great guns. So for that reason, use gun rammer. On top of this, you have 370mm of heat penetration. Why would you need any more than that? Yes, its standard ammo penetration is not the best, but it's still decent for tier 9. It's a heavy tank's level of penetration. You can penetrate the majority of tanks you face. So you don't need calibrated shells. The heat penetration is just insane on this tank. If you can't penetrate a tank, use heat and it will go through. So use gun rammer for this choice, because as a tank destroyer a lot of the time you just need that faster reload, and you'll see that in the gameplay later. There are situations where I would have just died or lost the battle or not been able to get off the shot by not having gun rammer, and I never struggle to penetrate an enemy tank, so there's just no reason for calibrated shells. Next, improved assembly or enhanced armor. Obviously improved assembly, because enhancing the armor on this tank is just pointless because you have very weak areas, which are the gun shield and the lower plate and the front of the upper plate. Next, use a camo net, of course, because this is a tank destroyer. As a base stat, it just has very bad view range, so there's no point using that. That wouldn't help you to spot enemy tanks easier, and the camo rating is just useful for when you do need to hide in a bush or be at longer ranges and remain unspotted. Definitely enhanced gunlaying drive, because this tank has pretty decent shell velocity, 1020 meters per second on its AP, and I believe 800 in the high 800s for its heat, and both of those are definitely enough for tier 9. If you can lead shells at least a bit, then you definitely won't need supercharger. And the aim time is so useful because, as said before, this tank's base aim time isn't actually that good, it's quite mediocre. And finally, definitely don't use vertical stabilizer because, as said before, this tank's gun handling is amazing for a tank destroyer. It's among the best out of any tank destroyers in the whole game. The only ones that are actually better are the tier 8 Chinese tech tree tank destroyer and the ISU 130. So definitely do use refined gun, because this tank's accuracy is rather mediocre, 0.335 base, and its gun handling is amazing. So just don't use vertical stabilizer, and it does feel a lot worse when you play it in battle. Vertical stabilizer seems to miss much more because a lot of the time you're sitting still and you can be fully aimed in. Before getting into the gameplay, I'll just compare it to its stock stats, and again, remember this tank has 4 stock modules instead of the usual 3. I'll just remove this and add on the traverse speed. So here you can see it has much worse DPM. In fact, its DPM is very bad for a tank destroyer. 2775 that's quite close to what the IS-8 has, and the IS-8 is a heavy tank with armor, so this isn't great DPM at all. 8.4 seconds reload. Again, that's fairly slow. A lot of the heavy tanks in this tier will out-reload you, and your alpha damage of 390 is low for a tank destroyer. Caliber goes down to 110, so it's worse for overmatching, but it's not a huge difference. Here you can see the aim time as well is a lot worse. Dispersion is much worse as well. This is more like a derpy 122mm dispersion. For example, an IS-5 in tier 8 has this dispersion. Gun handling is also worse on the turret traverse, and this is because of gun upgrades. As you upgrade the gun, this will get better, so that's also getting worse. And the maximum dispersion, this is calculating for when you're moving, your aim time, your actual base dispersion, and how fast you can go, is a lot worse just because you have worse aim time, gun handling, and dispersion. In terms of mobility, the speeds don't change, but your acceleration does get a lot worse, and it is quite a bit, roughly 2 horsepower per ton on each terrain type, and your traverse speed is terrible, going down by 12 degrees on medium terrain, and that makes you among the slower tank destroyers. For example, at tier 10, a Badger has this level of traverse speed, so it's actually very bad, and definitely don't play this tank when stock. Generally, with season tanks, when they're stock, they're just garbage. The Hazard 1 is sort of a rarity where it's actually decent and playable, but generally, for example, on this tank, the Argonaut, it's not good at all, and it's not worth playing in the slightest. So next, I won't get into the stats of these comparisons, but here I've compared it to the SU-122-54, which I believe is the most similar in terms of its gameplay, and the Waffenträger Ritter, which is somewhat similar in its gameplay. You can see the DPM is the same as the Waffenträger, but it has less alpha damage. Its alpha damage is more than the SU, but its reload is worse. And you can see that its penetration is actually very similar to the SU, only off by 2mm, but remember, the Argonaut has much more heat penetration than the SU. In terms of its shell velocity, it's pretty decent as shown, but the Ritter is just much better at sniping, and you can see that with its stats on its gun. This tank, you can see, has just got worse aim time and dispersion, but its gun handling, as you can see, is extremely impressive compared to these other 2 tanks. And that's something really nice when you're playing an active playstyle, which you do take up in later stages of the battle. Gun depression is 6, which is actually nice compared to the SU, because the SU only has 4. Mobility wise, this tank is pretty good. It's not quite as good as the SU because that tank is just very quick, but you sort of trade off with the gun angles that the Argonaut has, which is better gun depression, and I believe its left and right gun arc is slightly better. Its top speed you can see is worse than the SU but better than the Waffenträger, and the reverse speed it says is 11. Let me just check this in game because I thought it was 12 kilometers. Okay, its reverse speed is 11, which is garbage. That is very bad. So that's definitely a big downside of the tank. But overall, its mobility is actually very good for a tank destroyer. It can traverse very quickly. You can see that compared to the Waffenträger here. But remember, the Waffenträger has a turret, so that's quite a big difference. And it's only barely better on hard terrain. But yeah, that's the stats. If you want to compare them yourself, you can go to Blitzkit and just grab in these two tanks. I believe the SU has the most similar gameplay because it's turretless, it's a sniper tank destroyer, its alpha damage is only different by 10, and it's got the similar sort of penetration on standard ammo. So I'll try to show some gameplays where I do both sniping and active gameplay. This first game isn't actually anything too special. I just wanted to show it because it does show that sometimes the armor does work, and this is a top tier game, so remember that tanks in this tier have less penetration, but again most of the time enemies will be shooting standard ammo at you. So here I've knocked down the tree and tried to reverse into it to get some camo rating, but an ISU wanted to take the position. Here I'm watching this crossing, and I'm just about able to get a shot there. That's something that's nice about this tank's velocity, is that you can get in shots quite easily, and you can snap. As you can see there, the WZ bounces off my upper plate using heat penetration. Actually, you can't see where the shot went, but the WZ has 270mm of heat penetration, and as I showed with the armor, 270 does actually bounce off the upper plate of this tank, since the upper plate is upwards of 300mm. Here you can see the good penetration on standard ammo is enough to go through tier 8 heavies. The Mills turret isn't great on flat ground, but it's still decent. I hit the gun of the Emil there, that's why it bounced. And here you'll be able to see the sort of alpha damage trading that's coming into effect. The Death Star did 258 to me, and I did almost 460 to them. So that's something that is quite nice about this tank. 430 alpha is quite significant, and you can feel that. Especially against the lower tier heavies and tank destroyers, which generally have 300 to 400 alpha damage. And of course, with this tank's great 7-second reload, you can easily out-reload most tanks. Sometimes it does low roll though, like here, that rolled low by 50 damage. But yeah, this game just shows, at first I tried sniping, but then decided to sort of flank around and reposition to get the sides of enemies, and now I'm going back to my original position, which is actually flanking the enemies, as they've now almost taken base C. But you can see that the good mobility here, its top speed of 42 is good enough. Here I use high explosive shells, but the top speed is good enough. 42 is quite decent, and the traverse speed and acceleration, especially on hard terrain like it is on New Bay here, is very nice. But you can see the aim time there, it's a little bit slow, and that is noticeable in battle when you're moving around. However, the gun handling, which is amazing, is very nice for snapshotting sometimes, and it does work. So that was 3,400 damage. I bounced one shot from the WZ, and I get 48,000 credits. So this game is mines. I snipe in this game, so This is mainly just to show what the tank is like when it is not being active. So here you'll see me take a bit of a interesting position. I usually take this in tank destroyers when I expect medium tanks to rush the hill. It doesn't happen in this game, my mediums take the hill. But I did have another game in mind where enemies did take the hill with their mediums, and this position works very well with this tank being able to farm with its damage per minute. But here you'll just see me watching the town sort of area as the heavy tanks are trying to push from there. And this is where the great 370mm of heat comes in. I was able to very easily go through the turret roof of the E75, which is a small weak point, but it is easy to go through if you have heat penetration, decent heat penetration. So here you'll see the sort of awkward thing about being a sniping tank destroyer. You can't really influence the game too much yourself. You have to wait for your allies to do stuff, like either for this 53 TP to die and for the enemy heavy tanks to push forward so I can shoot them, or for the 53 TP to spot them so I can shoot them. It's a bit of the awkward dilemma for sniping tank destroyers, but you can't really push in this tank since its armor isn't strong, and it doesn't have that high hit points. If you push too early in the game, you'll just get killed and lose all your hit points, and your DPM isn't good enough to really completely kill an enemy heavy tank or an enemy medium tank, for example. Here you'll see why this position is quite nice, because you can just shoot the hill, the mill being on the hill. But here you see that great heat penetration, just able to go through the Emil's turret with no issues at all. But again, here I'm just waiting for stuff to happen really. And I explained this in my review on my website, that you can actually play aggressively in the later parts of the game, or not aggressively but more actively. So here I'm pushing forward to take down this E75, which is now basically a 2-shot, but I might have to shoot 3 times for him to go down. And you can see with the average alpha of 430, I do have to shoot him 3 times, but only taking 1 shot in exchange for 3 shots shows you that the great DPM working. Now I don't want to push forward because there is a Borsig who has very high camouflage rating sitting in the bushes at the back, and that's a bit of a problem for my team because I believe we're all on quite low hit points. Yep, we're all 1-shots for the Borsig, so we're not pushing, and I decide to flank around the back of the town so I can get the object. Flanking around the back works because there is that rock in the way of the Borsig, you can see it here, and you also have these houses which you could hide behind. Given that the Borsig doesn't move, of course. But here I've just seen the object go over the top of the hill, so I keep pushing forward. And here is an unfortunate shot. It goes low into his tracks. That one wasn't fully aimed, you could see there was still a bit left on the aim time. So I did make a bit of a snapshot there, and it went low. And that does happen sometimes on this tank. It does make a few frustrating shots, but generally the gun is quite good and accurate because of its great stabilization. Especially when it's moving, it is noticeable that it is a bit better than other tank destroyers because its gun just handles well when you're moving. It doesn't bloom out too much. So here you can see I go around and I take the shot because I have enough hit points, and we manage to take down that win. So that game was mainly just sniping. You can see that I had to use bushes and stay at long range, but the tank does work fairly well in those situations because it can fully aim, and when using refined gun, 0.285 dispersion is quite accurate. Again, making decent credits, and I'm not using credit boosters in any of these battles. So this game on Himmelsdorf was the best game I've had so far. I haven't played too many battles in this tank, but I've played quite a few to try and get some battles against tier 10 as well, but as you can see, I didn't get too many battles against tier 10. One of the good battles I had was on mines, and I'll show that in a video that doesn't have commentary uploaded later to my channel. But these battles are just against tier 8. Here it's a bit annoying because the AMX is sort of sitting in front of the targets. But here again I'm taking a sniping position to shoot down the rails of Himmelsdorf. And then the Contracaro gets in the way again. So this situation for the Argonaut is a dilemma for whether to push or not, or whether to go and try and help the heavy tanks, but I decide to push forward with my other two allies who are still alive and try and win base A. And this is where you can see the Argonaut plays like a medium tank. It's agile on hard terrain, it can traverse very quickly, it has a fast reload like medium tanks, but it's got that high alpha, which is nice. Also, for a tier 9 tank destroyer, you can see I have 1,700 hit points. Compared to tier 8 tanks, that's actually a lot, so you can actually play quite actively in tier 8. And in a second you'll see me sort of use these hit points to buy some damage against the T-30, since none of us really want to push him, and I don't want my Nebulon to die because we sort of need his gun in the game.
Enemy armor is damaged. We're immobilized. Frac fixed. Let's roll.
So here you see we've just won base A completely, and now the flanking heavy tanks on the other side have pushed towards our rear. I take a shot there, but now that IS-6 isn't looking, I'm going to go around the side and try and get some more damage. And you could see I bounced off his upper plate. That was a bit of a snapshot. I didn't fully aim. If I did, I would have been able to hit the green areas, or the penetrable areas, which are further up.
Enemy vehicle destroyed.
So that's the thing with this tank. You sometimes have to snapshot, which is a bit annoying because ideally you want to fully aim in, because this tank doesn't have the best dispersion or the best aim time. And because of that aim time, it just takes a bit longer for the aim circle to go in. So sometimes it is annoying to miss shots or to sort of miss the target, like on the Object 252U. So in this situation the K91 has still got 2 shots left. I don't want the Nebulon to push because then he can be killed. But he doesn't have enough damage in his magazine to kill both of us. So I push forward and the Nebulon does go down, but due to this tank's good reload, I'm able to kill the K91. And as you can see there, this wasn't a situation where I could have lost that easily, but the K91 would have gone round that corner and I wouldn't have been able to kill him if I hadn't been using the gun rammer, because it was just that tiny few milliseconds that allowed me to kill him before he went around the corner. And as you could see with the penetration, this tank has no issues going through the fronts of heavy tanks, so you really don't need calibrated shells at all. That game I did 4,000 damage, and you can see I got 200,000 credits, and that's because of these medals all giving extra credits. Well, not that one, but high caliber does. And that's why it made so many credits in that game. So yeah, the Argonaut, it's not worth getting because it is just so expensive. You can't get this tank for free even if you play as actively as you can. You need to spend money to get fully upgraded Quetzal modules, and then that means you need to spend money to even get this tank in your garage, and then it means you need to spend even more money to get this tank fully upgraded with all of its modules. So it's just not worth it because of the price. Overall, it's a pretty nice tank. It has a good gun, it has great mobility for a tank destroyer, it has okay camera rating, and okay sort of armor. It's like a sort of different version of this tank with less awkward gun depression and just nice penetration, really. So yeah, it's definitely not a bad tank. It's nothing too amazing, or it's nothing too super unique for tier 9, but it is quite a good tank as a tank destroyer in its role. It's not worth getting just because it's expensive, which is unfortunate because a lot of players might like to have this tank. And as we can see with Wargaming selling season tanks in store, they're gone now, but they are very expensive to buy when Wargaming brings them back after the season. You could get all three Season 1 tanks for 78,000 gold, which just isn't an amount which most players have, and if you want to buy the tanks on their own, they come stock without any modules, so you'd need to spend sort of just 60k just to get a tier 9. For example, the Regressor as stock, you had to get sort of 60k gold worth to buy the tank and then upgrade its modules. So it's just not worth it at all for a tier 9 tank, which isn't really overpowered or anything too special. So unfortunate that its price is that much, but overall a good tank. Don't try and get it unless you're really rich and you have just want to collect it. But yeah, that's the Argonaut. And again, Wargaming has released a tank without giving it to us contributors early. It's the Soul Eater. I've played it. It's a great tank, I think. I'll do a review of it later, hopefully. I have to first do the one on the website because I like understanding its stats and getting out its armor profile first. But yeah, this is a good tank. It's in store for crates. Don't gamble for crates. It's not worth it. But I'll do this one later today, probably, or tomorrow. Thanks for watching.